Thanks very much for attending another hot evening to open the Kennedy Gathering. I just wanted to say Paddy sitting next to me is graciously recording this presentation. We've got some very complicated technology running the presentation on two different screens. And we do have a roving mic if there's questions so that the audio will come through. You won't be visible, but your questions will be audible if you wait for the roving mic. So stick your hand up if you've got questions, and we'll go. What I'd like to talk to you about tonight is Irish Kennedy lineages, the Kennedy DNA project that we're doing. There's another Kennedy DNA project that Paddy's talking about that's international. Give you an update on our research on the different Kennedy family trees particularly around Tipperary and Limerick, where we're where we've started focusing on a new tool called Banyan DNA that hopefully will help us solve a lot of Kennedy cousin mysteries. As Tom has talked about in the newsletters that have come through for the group, I'll talk a little bit about a new DNA adventure with the FBI, and just finish up with on the long end, descendants in Australia for a long time, and a number of years ago he was so frustrated in trying to sort out which of the many Kennedys was the one that was linked to his tree, that he uploaded a rant that went on for a few paragraphs, and he titled it "Too Many Bloody Kennedys," and he uploaded it into his ancestry.com tree, and I think it's been deleted from his tree, but it's been immortalized in many DNA trees around the world. So if you see "Too Many Bloody Kennedys," it's probably not a bad explanation for the sort of difficulties and challenges we have trying to connect all the different lines. I wanted to give a shout out to Father Rhodey Kennedy, who really was probably instrumental in starting an understanding of a lot of the work on the Kennedys, particularly around sadly, he's sort of also written books on another line now, but tonight we'll just talk about the Kennedys. And he really kick-started the whole Irish Kennedy Heritage Group, from what I'm aware. His son Terence tonight will be talking about a lot of Brian's works at the end of the night. All right, so I thought I would just explain again where we're up to with the autosomal DNA project that Tom Ryan in Newbridge and myself are administrating. It started for people who are DNA tested and were seeking common ancestors of the Kennedys around the northern Tipperary and eastern Limerick. It's sort of expanded beyond that now. We've got there's more than 959 kits that have joined us around the world. We've got a research tree that's out to 63,000 plus, and it's always growing. So that's the latest update. When we were talking about tonight's night, and I was talking about the different Kennedy lines that we're working on, it occurred to me that it would be useful to show you some of the challenges. there are so many different Kennedy lines. Those of you that were at the Heritage or at the castle today will have heard about a number of those, and I'll show some slides in a few minutes to reinforce that. But one of the other things you may not be aware of is that so many people have more than one Kennedy line if they go back far enough, and that can make it even more challenging. And so as a little exercise, I'll just for the next few slides quickly whip through the members of the committee and the different numbers of Kennedy lines that we have. Now, sadly, Richard and I only have one Kennedy line. Tom, our chieftain, has two different Kennedy lines, one going through Banshire, Ballanglenna, and probably out to Portnard, another one going back to Garavan. Mari, who you would have heard at the castle this afternoon, she's got one Kennedy line that I know about, but she's recently discovered a second Kennedy line that I think is on her mother's side. Sorry about that extra branch at the bottom. I had meant to delete that. So she's got two Kennedy lines. Pat Kennedy from Tumavara has got two Kennedy lines. His wife Phyllis has got her own Kennedy line as well. Tom from Glastrogan has got three separate Kennedy lines. Previous chieftain, Rhodey Kennedy, beats all of us because he had 5 different Kennedy lines out of. In fact, with Rhodey, he only knew of 4, and it was DNA that really helped us sort out the 5th, because not long before Rhodey passed, we were identifying the fact that he matched DNA with a number of people that didn't match any of his Kennedy lines, and we were able to actually track a fifth line back to another Kennedy line. So that's one of the advantages of doing DNA. It actually sometimes helps us take things back beyond what living memory and easily accessible records show. For those of you that think we're all intermarried and second marriages are a problem, don't worry about second cousin marriages. There was Professor Robin Fox, who's now passed away, wrote a book, and he called Kinship and Marriage, and through some very sophisticated research, he's been able to estimate that 80% of all children born in human history have likely been born to second cousins or closer. For a lot of good reasons. For most of history, people lived within a 5-mile radius, meaning that dating or marrying outside of that area would have required travelling distances that were often impractical. And anthropological research suggests that marrying within the extended family was the default, and it was a successful strategy for societies to survive until at least the time of industrialisation. And it's not even just a thing of the past. 10% of global marriages today are between first and second cousins. In some regions of the Middle East and North Africa, the rate still exceeds 50%. And when we're doing genealogical research, we talk of a concept called pedigree collapse, and that's where we find related ancestors in our tree. It's a natural phenomenon. It's where duplicate ancestors are filling spots in our tree, and the world's historical population was too small to support an infinitely expanding tree of unique individuals. So it's inevitable that there will be, multiple occasions where we'll have the same ancestral couple showing up more than once. Now, Mari referred to this today. This was a wonderful document that was created in around 1580. It was preserved in the Ormond deeds that were kept at Kilkenny Castle, and Dr. Edmund Curtis from Trinity College Dublin transcribed and published it. And this list was of the leading freeholders of Ormond at that time in 1580. So we're talking 60 plus years before Cromwell. And these were the local great men who held land and influence under the Earl of Ormond at the time. You can see from this that Kennedy dominance in both Upper Ormond and Lower Ormond. So in Upper Ormond, they only listed 15 prominent freeholders and 12 were O'Kennedys. They were mainly, they owned their own land, yeah, so pre-Cromwell. And so there were Kennedy Browns and Kennedy Reds. In Lower Ormond, half the O'Kennedys, a little more than half, were the freeholders. So you can see there were so many, even in the 1500s, there were so many different Kennedy large owners. Now, I just wanted to talk about the Kennedy name in Ireland. The Dalcassian pedigree represents one major and off. Sure. Yep. I'm happy to make a copy of them available afterwards, but I'll remove the ones. Oh yeah. But you know that the Dalcassian pedigree shouldn't be treated as a universal family tree for everybody with the name Kennedy. There's a lot of ways that people, that people in Ireland have the name Kennedy. So there are the descendants of the Dalcassian family of Clare and Ormond. There are other Kennedy family lineages. There was a Kennedy family or O'Kennedy family associated with East Galway and South Roscommon. I'll just say at the outset, I'm not good with Gaelic or with Irish pronunciation, so I'm not going to try and embarrass myself. So throughout the presentation, I'll use the Kennedy version rather than a lot of the Irish versions. There's also descendants of Scottish Kennedys, mainly in Ulster, and some Kennedys from the Irish Republic that over the centuries have migrated up into the north. And then there are smaller surname groups that have been formed independently or through surname changes, and other paternal lines that have been introduced through ordinary family events over centuries. So there's a lot of different Kennedy family lines. The Dalcassians are the ones that a lot has been written about. They were originally around Dalcassian comes from descendants of the son of Conall of the Swift Steeds. He was a man that lived between 359 and 434 AD. So we're talking about 1800 years ago. And then it goes down, as you can see, a lot of the Irish surnames that you will be familiar with are Dalcassian and descend from various descendants of Cass. Right at the bottom, you can see Brian Boru, his brother Doncoon, who the Dalcassian Kennedys come from. But also there's Bolins and O'Regans and Powers and Toomeys from the Doncoon line, and many others as well. So how the Dalcassian Kennedys came to North Tipperary is they're actually forcibly driven out of Clare and they settled heavily in County Tipperary, particularly the Upper and Lower Ormond. I mentioned before that the with the Dalcassians. He found a number of other individuals who had the name Kennedy or O'Kennedy in all sorts of other unrelated genealogical traditions, and which really shows that Kennedy wasn't a personal name. Well, it was a personal name used by more than one Irish lineage, not just not a name confined to the Dalcassians. Specifically, he found lines associated with a number of these different Irish lineages, which you can read, and I'll talk about over the next couple of lines. The important thing is these were distinct medieval populations with their own territories, ruling families and genealogical traditions. They didn't all necessarily found a lasting Kennedy surname lineage. It's often difficult with medieval pedigrees to date when they were existing precisely and exactly where they were existing, because not every personal name became hereditary as a surname. But what his findings prove is that the underlying personal name was shared by several unrelated or only distantly related groups. And where you can see on a map now, the actual shaded areas on the map are approximate, but you can see where the Dalcassians were over from Clare into, well, eventually moving into Tipperary, but they started in Clare, and you can see there was a separate group that was centred around County Laois, another group around Kilkenny and Southern Laois, another in Offaly and Northern Territory, Northern Tipperary, and then another one in Munster, Tipperary, Limerick and Cork, and then a final one down around Southern Tipperary and Cork and Kerry. So there were a number of different lineages that he found through all of those documents over the centuries. I think I've just been through that, so I'll move on. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's also Scottish Kennedy DNA, which is very distinct DNA from Irish Kennedy DNA, but there is a lot of that in Ireland. Most of the Scottish Kennedys that came across to Ulster came across in the 17th century, in the early 1600s. It was mainly privately sponsored Scottish settlements in Antrim and Down. And from about 1609, the official plantation of Ulster brought larger numbers of Scottish settlers, and they moved into confiscated lands in Donegal, Tyrone, Londonderry, Armagh, Fermanagh and Cavan. And then later in the 17th century, further migration continued down through those family connections and trade and military service. So there was a lot of there were a lot of different Scottish families that came across, but not all Kennedys in Ulster were of Scottish origin. John Grenham, a great Irish genealogist, he has identified a branch of Southern Irish Kennedys that had moved up into County Antrim as far back as the 17th century. And so a Kennedy family that's been living in Ireland for 3 or 4 centuries and may identify as long-standing Irish in identity may well have a paternal origin in Scotland, because the Scottish Kennedys came a long time ago. The other thing to remember is that the medieval O'Kennedys were not just a biological family. They were leaders of a wider political and military following, a big clan, and their forces could include junior or distantly related branches or neighbouring families or tenants or clients or dependents or other warriors that fought under Kennedy leadership. And in Gaelic Ireland, a surname could act as a badge of political allegiance as well as ancestry. Surnames only really started to be used in Brian Boru's time, and a family attached to a powerful dynasty might adopt or later be recorded under the surname of its leading house. And so some of the families that were fighting alongside the O'Kennedys may have become known as O'Kennedys themselves, despite not having Dalcassian ancestry. All right, now moving on to the specific Kennedy research and away from the medieval stuff. This first couple of slides is based on Father Rohde's research. Now, I'm not going to go through all of that in detail. The message I want to show is that there's a number of these Kennedy lines, and in the 1800s, these large Kennedy families, farming families, spread out across multiple townlands. Now, Father Rhodey talked about the Turin-Bryan Kennedys. There was a Patrick Kennedy in Turin-Bryan who had 2 sons. He had 5 sisters that all spread into different townlands. One of his sons was unmarried. The other son had descendants that spread right across, the areas from Templederry down to Limerick and across to Newport. So we've extended some of Father Rhodey's research and tracked those families down to today. He wrote a lot about Long Andrew, and Long Andrew, many of you will have heard of. He was born in Glencroe, in the early to mid 1700s. He's buried in Templederry. We know on the right-hand side, we know about certain children and branches from Father Rhodey's notes and from the research and DNA that we've been doing in the years since. We also know that there may be another 3 children. We're still trying to confirm that. We know that from multiple DNA matches. Margaret, Ellen and Bridget we're working on. And his father was Hugh Kennedy, who is also buried in Templederry. And a lot of you who have come across Long Andrew and his father may see that there's a wife recorded for Hugh Kennedy in a lot of DNA trees, in a lot of online trees. I'm not convinced that that's the right person, but it's in so many trees now, it's hard to change. It's likely that Hugh Kennedy had at least 3 other sons. We know from Father Rhodey's notes that Hugh Kennedy had at least 2 wives and possibly 3 wives. We're not sure of any of those wives' names, but the Glencroe Kennedys descend from Matthew Kennedy, who on DNA and local history is likely to be Long Andrew's brother. The Bleenbeg Kennedys on DNA descended from a William Kennedy, who is also likely to be Long Andrew's brother. And I've only just added a 4th one, John, who the Glown Kennedys are descended from. And I've done that because the Glown gravestone in Templederry Cemetery has Hugh Kennedy listed on their gravestone. So it, I can't think of any other reason why that would be the case. So I'll now be trying to confirm that with DNA over the next few months. There's a number of other possible children that are also suggested by multiple DNA batches. So a Mary married to Berkery, and a William married to Bridget Ryan, a Martin whose descendants come down through, some of whose descendants include Big Nellie Kennedy and her descendants in Borrisoleigh, and the Mackeys of Gleno through a Catherine who's married to Daniel Mackey. And DNA supports all of that, but we're still proving it. The Portnard Kennedys are another one of these Kennedy groups. Now, the known line is Michael Kennedy and Margaret Humphreys, and a Richard Kennedy who married Judith Sadlier, and their descendants spread across Ballyvareen, Shanaboola, Tipperary Town, Ballyborough, and Castle Mungret. But based on, again, on multiple DNA matches, it seems likely that they also, Michael Kennedy and Margaret Humphreys also had a son, Brian, married to Elizabeth O'Dea, who were in Foyley Clearer, another son, Matthew, who married Margaret Dwyer, and was in Ballinglana, and then with many descendants in Australia, particularly in New South Wales, and then an Ellen who married Edmund Corbett and went to Holyford. The Glastrogan Kennedys, so the sort of starting point is Patrick Kennedy married to Mary Berkery. There are a lot of different Kennedy lines. The ones that I've got in blue there, Brian Kennedy and Anthony Kennedy, I've got in blue because we'll come back to them at the end of the presentation. One of the things I wanted to point out from here, though, is you can see there's a lot of Kennedy matches here. So in the first generation, Rhodey Kennedy married Judy Kennedy. In the next generation, Joanna Kennedy married Patrick Kennedy. Ellen Kennedy married Tatey Kennedy at Garavan. Margaret Kennedy married James Kennedy. So just in those two generations, there are at least 4 Kennedy marriages. Something that's been troubling me for a couple of years is why there was this period of time where all of these large Kennedy farmers managed to get so many of their sons placed on large Kennedy farms across the multiple townlands. And I did a master's at UL a couple of years ago, and in my supervisor actually suggested to me in reading a draft of some of my work that I should look up this article written by Kevin Whelan now 30 years ago, and he wrote about an underground gentry and this concept of Catholic middlemen in the 18th century. Now, I must say this is a hypothesis. It makes a lot of sense to me. It's certainly consistent with what we've been finding, along multiple Kennedy families, but it's still a hypothesis. What he suggested was that the descendants of some of the dispossessed Gaelic and Old English gentry before Cromwell often survived as substantial farmers and often sublet their farms to, after the confiscations, the Cromwellian confiscations. They acted as shadow lords or underground gentry. They had contempt for the new gentry. They considered the Protestant as mushroom gentry, illegitimate upstarts, and that had their land from conquest rather than from bloodlines. And they preserved the ancestry and the kinship and the memory and the Catholic identity. They served as brokers and arbitrators and community leaders. They supported the Catholic Church through clergy, money, and chapel sites. And by the mid-1800s, these big Catholic farmers inherited this identity. They didn't see themselves as tenants so much as proprietors in waiting, and who were morally superior to the official gentry, and ultimately, after several centuries being tenants on their own farms, ended up coming back and owning the land that they were renting. It's an interesting concept. It's only a hypothesis, but it does explain why everywhere we're looking at these big farming families, there was this period of time when their sons just all spread out across the mountains into big farms. So discovering how cousins connect. So we have so many DNA kits now that we're looking at, that we're able to look at and try to determine the connections. But we often find that we match DNA with people and we haven't been able to work out the common ancestor. It's just back before the available records in parishes. DNA is probably in most cases our only way of finding those connections, and there's been quite a number of cases now where we've taken our family trees back an extra 1 and even sometimes an extra 2 generations based on DNA matches. Some of it's highly probable but unproven. Some of it we're confident we can prove. There is a company called Banyan DNA that run an application which I've recently come to use, and I'm working with them to try to solve some of these Kennedy mysteries. The banyan tree seems to me that they got their name from seems a very appropriate name for the sort of work connecting the Kennedy lines. The pictures on the right are of banyan trees. These are trees that are called walking trees because they continually drop new roots. And the third one down there is a banyan tree in Brisbane that's 150 years old. Its canopy is 49 metres. But the one at the bottom is the largest tree in the world. It's in the Indian Botanic Gardens. It covers 5 acres. The tree itself is 5 acres wide, 250 years old, and it's got 4,000 aerial roots. So they've named their program Banyan DNA, and it's as though they could be naming it for our challenges with connecting the Kennedys. And what you do with a tree like this is you start with DNA matches, and then you build trees backwards, including places, spouses, townlands. You add in the amount of DNA that each of the DNA testers share with each other, and then you can propose hypotheses and run all sorts of mathematical calculations to work out the probability that you've got somebody put into the right spot, that the actual connections are what they're supposed to be. I'll just show you a screenshot. I've anonymised it so you won't see any of the details, but that's just about 10 or 15% of the current Kennedy one I'm working on, and it's a work in progress, but hopefully by this time next year we'll be able to give you an update. Tom alluded to this. I just want to talk briefly about Anzac Day in Australia this year. Anzac Day is a big day in Australia. It commemorates a gallant, tragic battle in Turkey in World War I, where a lot of Australians and New Zealanders died. I got an email on Anzac Day from the FBI from a special agent in Sacramento who was working on a homicide investigation, and he, with an unidentified skull, as it turns out, that had been found in 4 years earlier in 2022, and they still haven't been able to identify the skull. So the murder investigation hasn't even started because they don't know who it is that is dead yet. And so we've been working on that. We have had a lengthy conversation. It turns out this skull was discovered in September 22. It's partially decomposed. There was no other parts of the body. They know it's 30. He was 30 to 60 years of age. In the last few weeks, they've added a forensic facial recognition, and they're still trying to identify him. The reason they contacted me was that a number of the DNA kits in our project and that I was managing matched this person. What we've been able to work out so far is that there's at least 7 kits that go back to this couple that I alluded to before from the Glastrogan Kennedys. And we know that the two that I mentioned earlier, Anthony and Brian, left Glastrogan and went to the US in the 1850s and haven't been, weren't in contact with the family, or that were lost to the family afterwards. Now, I think I've actually worked out that Brian Kennedy, we know that Brian Kennedy married a Kennedy from Tumavara, and after a few years went to the US. I think I found him, and that he went to Canada, had 2 children, and then went to America. Haven't been able to find Anthony. I think that's the most likely place that the next starting point, and it may be over to the FBI to try to track it down through the 1900s. Obviously, whoever this person is, it would be lovely to be able to identify them and allow a proper burial, and for them to be reconnected to their families, which is what it's all about. 2022. Yeah, 4 years they haven't been able to identify. So the Sacramento police weren't able to identify him, and so they called in the forensic unit. They call it Forensic Investigative Genetic Genealogy, FIG. The FBI have a big unit, and they called them in specifically. Well, yeah, I can. Yeah, we can. We might need the side profile. I showed that to someone. I showed the picture to someone, and they said, "Yeah, that looks like an Irish. That looks like an Irish head." So I don't know. There's actually a number of people in this room who have got connections going back to the Glastonbury Kennedys. A number that I know. Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's at least half a dozen. Yeah. For forensic investigative genealogy, they can do it from a number. You know, for us, it's either a cheek scrape or it's saliva. But for forensic investigative genealogy, which is a very specialised thing, they can do it from all sorts of fragments. So from hairs or from semen or from, you know, other bodily fluids. And I'm sure from dentition, yeah. So in this case, it would almost certainly have been either from a tooth or from bone behind the ear. Yeah. Okay. It was Placer County, actually, if that means anything to you. Placer County.
Yeah. Where I live.
Okay. Anyway, look, I just thought, I'm coming towards the end, I just thought I would run through a little bit about forensic investigative genealogy, genetic genealogy. It's a fairly new field. Some of you will have heard a little bit about it. Traditional police DNA databases, when they test DNA found at a crime scene, they're really built for one purpose, and that's finding a direct match to someone. So if they have a suspect and they've found DNA at a site, they're trying to confirm that the DNA at the site is from their suspect. It works very well when they've got, you know, a very close relative to test. The problem is that most people in the world aren't in their databases, and if there's no close match, that they've reached a dead end. It's good for identifying a specific potential candidate for whatever crime they're looking for, but it's weak for finding distant relatives like second or third or fourth cousins. And that's where forensic investigative genealogy can change the picture. It's not looking for an exact match, it's looking for second and third and fourth cousins and then building trees from that. Shared DNA is the basic clue that's used in genetic genealogy, whether we're doing it for our family trees or we're doing it for this forensic work. Each of us inherits about half our DNA from each parent, but not exactly the same pieces as our brothers and sisters or cousins. So that's why different relatives can share different amounts of DNA. But the important principle is simple. The more DNA two people share, the closer their relationship is likely to be. So a parent shares 50% of DNA with their child. A grandparent or an uncle, or an aunt or an uncle shares about 25%, and first cousins about 12.5%. Second cousins about 3%, and so on. Third cousins matter because they sit at a really useful point in genetic genealogy. They're distant enough to open up older branches of a family tree, but often still close enough to be able to share detectable DNA. And in forensic cases, that's often the crucial point. A third cousin match may not tell us the person's name directly, but it can point investigators towards the right ancestral couple, as in this case, or the right family line, and then they can work down from there. And from there, genealogists first build trees forwards and backwards, looking for where the DNA evidence and age and location and case details all fit together. So it helps in two main situations: identifying suspects and giving names back to unidentified remains. In this case, that's what needs to happen before they can start another investigation. And I think most of us would agree that we'd be very happy if our DNA helped one of our cousins who's died somewhere and has been unidentified to be identified and to be given the opportunity to give the family closure and perhaps be brought back home. The criminal matter's different, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So what happens with forensic investigative genealogy is they got DNA evidence from somewhere, they upload it to a special part of a program called GEDmatch, usually, sometimes to Family Tree DNA. They're looking for distant relatives especially third cousins is the sort of sweet spot. Then they build the family trees, and then they identify candidates and investigate. It's obviously not enough to convict someone, but in a lot of the successful cases, once they've narrowed it down to one or two likely suspects, then they'll get DNA from that person, and they're looking for a complete match, but at least they can narrow down the field to a couple of candidates. There was a study done in 2020 that looked at what DNA, what FIG had been able to achieve in the 5 years since it really started in 2015. What they found was, at that stage, it was mainly in the US and Canada and Sweden, and they had solved 436 cases. Most were criminal, but I think about 20% were identifying previously unidentified human remains. On average, the cases that had been unsolved had been solved the mystery. More than that, they completely exonerated two people, one who had been in jail for 20 years. So, it can help solve cases, identify remains, and in some situations correct miscarriages of justice. Some of the key milestones: first case was January 2015, and there was a killer in Arizona who was identified this way. And then identified for, I think, about 40 years. And in April 2018, they were able to put a name to her. She was called the Buckskin Girl because she was wearing a buckskin jacket. Her name is Marsha King. Her family's got closure. Her name's back. 2 weeks later, the Golden State Killer that's probably the case that many of you will have heard about. It's the case that there's been books written and documentaries told about. The forensic genealogist that was instrumental in that spoke at a DNA conference I attended in Dublin years ago, and that was really the case that made law enforcement all over the world recognise the opportunities. In 2018, it was used for humanitarian work. There was in California, in Paradise, there was a campfire, and the victims were unable to be identified any other way. And it was
dating my first wife, who's counting, right? Anyway, we're sitting on the couch, and it was a busy house, a lot of people. And this is when it's called the East Side Radio. And he had just started, so there was, you got the door, and there's a little partition, and then you look this way. Here's the door open, it's no big deal. But I see the door open up, black glove, and the guy sticks his head in, and he looks down, and then he starts pulling the door closed, and that's when it clicked. I didn't know who it was, but as it turns out, it was that guy. And this is when this is really early. He used to get really busy with a mustache. And I jumped up, I grabbed the only thing that was a petty board and ran up. He was on a 10-speed bicycle. And it was really foggy in Sacramento. But I could see the 10-speed bicycle trail went up, and he had taken that derailleur thing off, so there was no noise.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
almost got it.
Yeah. Well, but if you had, maybe forensic but if you had, maybe we wouldn't be doing FIG today. Yeah. It turns out he was a policeman, so he was a policeman. And in fact, there was two different serial killers. One was the East Side Rapist, I think, and there was another one. And it was only when they started doing this work that they realised it was the one person who had been doing all of these across multiple counties. But no, thank you for that. This is the most important part, I think, about doing, FIG in terms of our DNA tests. I mean, what we're doing them for our family tree research, but it's really about identifying human remains. Unidentified homicide victims, historical remains, disaster victims, and long-term missing persons. The database policies of different companies, GEDmatch is the main one that's used for this sort of research, and they have a GEDmatch Pro version, which is used by, the forensic genealogists. With GEDmatch, they automatically allow all kits in there to be, unless the kit has been specifically removed from any matching, they allow the kits to be used for identifying unidentified remains. But no kit is uploaded for any criminal investigations unless the testee specifically allows it to be done. So it's opt-in for identifying remains, but it's automatically in for unidentified remains, but your DNA is only used if you specifically say that you want it to be used for criminal investigations. The test that I'm managing, I don't put down for criminal investigations unless someone tells me that they want that to happen. Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, they don't allow any tests to be uploaded that aren't uploaded with their saliva or their own sampling. So that can't be done. The family tree DNA allow certain kits to be used, but only with subpoenas. One more slide. Thank you for sticking with me. This is my sort of actually two more slides, but the last one's conclusion. But this is really just to make the point that it's about a period of urgency in doing family history. One of the things that we often find here in Irish family history is that we reach a wall around the early 1800s because that's when most parish registers of baptisms and marriages begin. Civil records, as you know, don't start until the mid-1800s. So really we're limited before the parish records become available. Before that point, documentary records very thin. Gravestones may have helped, but many 18th century and earlier inscriptions are worn, broken, or unreadable, and autosomal DNA really gives us one possible bridge across that gap. The oldest living family members today are especially valuable because they may still carry larger segments inherited from ancestors that lived in the 1700s. And those segments can create matches with distant cousins, and those matches may point back to a shared Kennedy ancestor before the surviving written records begin. But that window won't stay open forever. With each generation, DNA from those earlier ancestors is broken into smaller and smaller pieces and passed on less predictably. And eventually, and it won't be long, living descendants will no longer share enough DNA to register as useful matches. So the message is simple. We need to be testing our oldest generation now, because once they're gone, some of the genetic evidence that could connect our Kennedy branches back into the 1700s will disappear with them. So that's my plea. And in closing, the Kennedy surname doesn't come from one DNA line. There are very deep Kennedy roots across Tipperary and beyond. DNA test results and traditional genealogy helps us connect Kennedy descendants of today back to their ancestors. The opportunity to find connections back to the 1700s will soon disappear. You've probably heard me quote this before. It's my catch cry. Every man has two deaths: when he's buried in the ground and the last time someone says his name. This sort of work helps us bring people back to life by bringing their names back. Our Kennedy story isn't just a line of descent. It's a network of families, places, memories, and DNA evidence. And this is the best opportunity we have to preserve it going back before 1800. Thank you very much.
Well done, Mark. Anybody want to ask a question? Mark is after covering an awful lot of ground in that. I'll ask a question, Mark, that was put to me by a lady on telephone recently. She wants to have her family DNA recorded. She would love her eldest brother to submit. He's reluctant to do so. She's happy to do it herself. Is she correct in the belief that it would be much better coming from a male than a female?
She's correct if you're talking about Y DNA, so the actual Y line. We didn't talk about that tonight. The Y line. She wanted to know what her Kennedy ancestral line going back to. I mean, I've got a test on 23andMe. I must admit, I found it fairly useless. I mean, it wasn't really designed for this sort of thing. They designed it more for health. You found one? Okay. Well, I mean, it's good. It's rarely used outside of the US. Ancestry have got the biggest database. 23andMe is second biggest, but probably less helpful in their data, or their company has been taken over a couple of times. So I guess there's more opportunity for things to have gone wrong. I haven't done anything about deleting mine at the moment. It's a small text file. The point I didn't same as a chimpanzee, because they've got, there's similar organ systems, and I think 70% of our DNA is the same as a cat, and other mammals. So the amount of DNA that's being looked at for the purposes of genealogy is only less than 1%, or just about 1%. And when we talk about the amount of DNA that we share with our cousins and with our parents, when I say we share 50%, in fact, we share with our parents, we probably share 99.5%, because the 99% is, it's a lot more than I said, because most of our DNA is actually about sort of how a human body is set up. And the small amount that's used for this research it's just a text file. If you ever see it, it's just a text file of amino acids and on certain chromosomes, and if someone can make something of that, well, I guess they can. Yeah.
Anybody else? Maybe we should break for tea and coffee. Came in there a while ago. I see it over there on the side. But we take a break now, and we'll come back to Dr. Petty Waldron then in a few minutes. Okay?